schools, and I'm glad to be here today. I'm here with my MSW intern, Laura Highholt, and we will get started. Today, we're going to be talking about conflict resolution through a trauma-informed lens. And if you've been able to watch the series that Amber was talking about earlier, that are housed on the NDE website, I would encourage you to do that. Something we're doing at our school is we have a Google Doc available to our students, or excuse me, not to our students, to our staff. And when each staff watches each video from the NDE website, we're reimbursing them $20 an hour or whatever your school would like to set up if they want to do that. And it's really been a successful piece to our recreating some education for our teachers. They're able to do it on their own time, and it's really nice. It's been a good foothold on how to work with kids that have been through a traumatic experience. So it's been really helpful. I think our teachers sure appreciate the information and that they can do it on their own time frame too. And so that's been really kind of a cool thing, and how we're getting our staff at LCC to utilize these webinars, if you will, on the mental health, the school mental health through NDE department. So I can share that Google Doc. It's just a couple questions that we ask our staff to document so that we know that they've watched these videos. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So talking about conflict resolution through a trauma-informed lens, like I said, I hope that you'll find it helpful. If you've seen the previous videos, it kind of goes in line and how to work with these students. So as you see on the completion of today, we're hoping that through this webinar, you will be better able to understand the brain development and student behavior under stress, be able to practice co-regulation and self-regulation, identify classroom strategies to support students experiencing distress, and hopefully in all to create a culture to resolve conflict. So if you look at the picture, the overall goal is to create a culture to resolve conflict, right? So the important takeaway is that when one feels like he or she belongs, they feel they are understood, supported, safe, and connected with affirming messages and opportunities for success while being heard and validated. So those are some of the things that we're talking about today, and in hopes that teachers can help be a part of that individual's healing and growth. Not that they are counselors or mental health practitioners, but we know that if we hold an environment that is safe and we can do these things, we can cultivate a better environment for these students and have better understanding and empathy for all. So moving on, we're going to start with trauma in the brain. So I have a short video just to review brain development. I don't think that you can talk about trauma without kind of going in a little bit deeper and see how the brain reacts to stress. So we're going to take a minute and hopefully this will work out.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions including emotion, behavior, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behaviour. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events, like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons. When someone's experienced trauma, they might be in a constant state of fight or flight, and so might use substances to help move them out of their stress response state. We also know that substance use can affect the way that our brain functions. Chemicals from substances cross the blood-brain barrier and can either stimulate or depress different parts of the central nervous system, affecting how the person feels, thinks, and acts. Similar to cortisol flooding the brain in the stress response, chemicals from alcohol and other drugs can also affect neural pathways and the way the person might make decisions or remember events. Luckily, neural pathways have the lifelong ability to form and change. You might have heard this referred to as neural plasticity. Through developing a better understanding of the brain and the way trauma and alcohol and other drugs affect neural pathways, clients can be better informed and empowered. This is an intervention itself called psychoeducation.
All right. Close that up. Oops. Let me go back here. Sorry about that. So some takeaways from that video. Oops, I'm gonna go back. After you listen to that, it's just fascinating, I think, how the brain is affected by stress. Our brains are affected by normal, typical development anyway. The child's brain and young adults' brain are continuously changing, as you notice in that video. Neural pathways make changes. However, we all have this normal alarm system in our brain and body that lets us know when we are under threat or mobilizes us into that fight, flight, or freeze in the face of a threat. However, if a youth experiences continuous threats of trauma, the brain and body is put into that chronic state of fear, which is activating the survival brain. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today as I go on. That survival brain, you might notice that in body cues of our students or other people that are in that as anxiety. It might be where they're calming or they're kind of going into that fetal position, or maybe you see that hypervigilant where they're searching and scanning their environment with their eyes and they look really anxious. That is what that hypervigilance looks like. And so we look at the brain development, and I think it's been fascinating. I'm sure at this point, many have heard of the trauma and brain development. Can you guys see the pyramids? Is that where you're at? The slide's not wanting to switch here. Let me think here. Sorry about that. Let's see. There we go. I'm sorry about that. The trauma in the brain, we talked about ACEs. I'm sure you've heard about the ACEs at this point. And really, it talks about the brain development and what we know and how that changes. And what research has shown is that stress and trauma interrupts that brain development, and that cortisol is that stress hormone that is released into the body. And so that's where you see that hyperarousal, that physiological response to activate the fight, flight, or freeze, which we call survival brain. And when a student is in that mode, we'll say, learning is really difficult to happen. It's really hard for them to feel calmed and comfortable. And learning is probably not an option at this point because they can't reason. They can't use that front part of the brain where reasoning happens. So as you notice from this slide, typical development is kind of the bottom, survival, right? If a child is taken care of with secure attachment, the parent, when the baby cries, they know that it gets fed or they help get comfort. That's that survival. That's the next part of regulation. The mom comes, I cry. The mom comes, she soothes me. I get regulated. Socially, emotionally, I have a secure attachment and I can learn. My cognitions are kind of on point, and you see that typical development. Now, in the face of trauma, which interrupts that development and tips the pyramid over, if continuously not feeling safe or protected or disconnected from that main parenting source or others, doesn't have to be the parent, but from someone taking care of them to help them regulate, they become kind of, their brain becomes used to that survival mode. And so once they're in that mode, they're looking for real or perceived threats of danger. And that's what we do call that hypervigilance. So you might see that in a classroom at some point. Really anxiety, if you're looking more for anxious, it might even be sensory, and you may not even be aware of what the trigger is for that student because we don't always know. Excuse me. However, like I said, you don't always know, right? We don't always have our history of students, and we certainly, they don't come in with all of that history. So I think it's important as educators and as parents sometimes that there's things to remember when working with challenging behavior. Number one, don't take it personally because it's not about you. Again, we don't always know what's happening with that student. Number two, the behaviors are challenging, and we have to flip the language and just remember that. The behaviors are challenging, but the child is not, right? Trying not to make it even personal on them. And three, de-escalate first. We can't problem solve. That student is not in learning brain if they're hyper vigilant and really stressing out if they're in that mode. And so we have to de-escalate them first, or ourselves even regulate. And four, sometimes we might not see it, but there's always a reason for a certain behavior. It may be something super small. They may not have the words to share at that point either, depending on age and just in their state of mind too. They may not know what's going on. And number five, we're just trying to create a sense of empathy. And we're going to talk about that a lot today. Having empathy, not only as educators, but as a community in our schools. We want our students to learn how to be empathetic towards other students as well. So just trying to imagine what that child is going through. I wanted to share an example of kind of like this. Years ago, I was doing therapy in Lincoln, and I had a student come in, and we'd worked for probably a year together. And I knew that there was some trauma with him, some pretty severe stuff. And we'd worked through a lot, and he'd gotten to the point where he was having less behaviors at school and at home, and he was really opening up. And so we saw a lot of improvement just over that year. And it took a lot of time, right? Because the students or kids or anyone for that matter has a really hard time trusting someone when they've been in a number of serious events of threats, as this child has. He was able to sit and have a 45-minute discussion with me, and we were working through things. So one day he came in and I had a couch, and he came and he just came into a fetal position. And I was like, hey, what's going on? And he couldn't speak at that point. So we kind of sat in silence, and I kind of used some soothing words and just said, hey, let's take some deep breaths together. And then through some time, he was able to point out, I went out to his staff. He had some staff that was also working with him. He lived in a group home. And I said, can you guys tell me what's going on? Like, how was his day? And they said, it's odd. He had a great day. We met with his teachers. They said he had a great day. He was excited to come talk to you about the great day that he had. And then something happened. We don't know what happened, but on the way here, something. And I'm like, okay. So I went back in and we started talking, and I said, just tell me about some of the good things about your day. And we went on. And then he curled up even tighter as he pointed out that on his way, he was in the back seat of his staff's car, and he heard loud noises of a muffler, and it made him think of his perpetrator. And he looked out the window, and it just happened to be the same color of vehicle and the same make and model of his perpetrator, who had sexually abused him for years. And the sound of the truck, the color of the truck, and everything just triggered him right back into that mode of freeze, and he curled up into that fetal position. So we worked through that, and we were able to de-escalate, and he actually was okay, and we walked through, and he was able to be okay. So it's something we had to work through, but it took most of that time. And that's a kid that I already knew the history of. So I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. But the green truck, the sound, that's really what it was that triggered him. I would have not known that, but he was able to use his words. And if that had happened any sooner in our therapy, I don't know, he would have had a really hard time even getting to that point as quickly as he did that day. So just, wanting to share that, because I feel like you might have some of those kiddos in your back mind thinking, oh, so we don't always know. But next thing, we all have a window of tolerance, right? So as you look at this slide, it's pretty typical, right? We all have a window of tolerance. It doesn't matter if you have a traumatized past or not. We all have one. So we all know that there are folks that have all the patience in the world. That's their demeanor. And it can take a whole bunch for them to lose their stuff or get into that hyper aroused moment, that point of overwhelming and stress. While others may have very little. And so as most of us have been under some sort of stress at times, we can all relate to this at some point. When I'm having a good day, my window of tolerance is actually probably a lot bigger. When I'm having a rough day, just like anyone else, and it's been one thing after another, my window of tolerance gets a little bit more narrow, where my fuse is shorter. Some kids like to use the fuses or the thermometers, or as you can see on this slide, that picture of the volcano, which that point where it's just going to blow, right? So imagine if you were in survival brain as described in the video, and you were in survival brain most of the time, your window of tolerance would likely be pretty short and fast reacting to that state of hyper arousal. So this is when we have to teach our students calming strategies and regulation skills to get through that. So again, with the story that I had shared earlier, he never got to the point that he blew up. And those were his normal behaviors. He would blow up and throw things and try to hurt himself. That day, he became more inward. So he never had an escalation trigger or blow up. So these can look different, for kids, just depending. We got him back to feeling okay before he left, and thank goodness. But it was kind of that hypoarousal, I guess, that day at the bottom. So, we want to be somewhere in the middle. That regulation piece is helpful. So looking at conflict resolution, that's our main topic for the day. It cannot be done unless we are calm and that learning brain is back on. So that is something that we have to remember when working with these kids or with our own kids at home and even ourselves. Let's be honest, we know ourselves. Hopefully, you know yourself that when you are not calm, it's really hard to think clearly, right? That's called road rage. Sometimes we can think of it that way too, where we're frustrated and we're not thinking and we might react in a way like, whoa, take a deep breath and I need to calm down. So how do we do it? First, we have to remember we got to regulate self first. Prior to helping someone else regulate, you are the force behind the co-regulation. So if you're working with a student that's regulated, you got to quick check yourself. Am I the one that should be dealing with this kiddo because I might be in a stressful situation? Am I being triggered from something of my own past or history? And if it is, I might have to tag out for a minute, or I might need to go find help much quicker. So you got to know yourself too, right? So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to share a screen next, but I think it's important to know we have to find the learning brain, right? And then utilize some language that can be helpful for your students. I'm starting to notice that you're getting upset. Your body cues are telling me that you're not okay or you're not feeling safe. What do you need from me? How can I help you? And right then you're building a relationship that's safe, right? And you're saying, what can we do? What can I do to help you? So you're trying to convey that safe message, and conversations matter. So if you know that you're upset and you're going to respond with short patience, you might need to take a minute, like I said earlier. What's really helpful in schools is you might have a PBIS language or something that is being taught in guidance where that language is used universally. At our school, we use zones of regulation. And so students K-4 know that language. And so I try to teach that in a way that teachers can also use that and have the posters around so that we can have that common language. Because that really sets a tone like, wow, I noticed you're kind of in the yellow zone. Maybe you're starting to lose a little control. What can we do? What are some tools that you use? And so if we can have our paras and our teachers and our counselors and even into our parents start using that same language, these kiddos, can learn that much quicker. And it helps give students some time to regain their calm. By using that language, I notice you're really upset. Let's work together on breathing slowly for a minute, or let's manage your impulses. And then maybe you're directing that student to be aware of their own thoughts. Hey, what's going on in your brain and body? What do you notice right now? Tell me how you feel or what you're thinking. And if you're ready to focus on moving forward with getting calm, we can do that. So you want to catch them in a certain matter. You got a short window once in a while. So you want to have students start to notice their own brain and body. And that comes sometimes at the end, and I'll talk about it shortly in a little bit. But you want to have the student kind of redirect themselves if they can, and giving them a minute. Can you take a minute? Do you have a calming corner? I know that was discussed earlier in some of the mental health webinars that have been on as well, and try to take them into that happier place or that healthier place. So that's kind of how we do it in a nutshell. But here is that phase, the different phases of conflict that can happen. So if you can catch them between the trigger, and that's that thing we don't always know, and that phase 2 of escalation, that might be where you see some of those body cues happening. That's where you want to try to catch that. Like, hey, I noticed you are starting to get upset. What are some body cues you're noticing, right? And so that's where that common language is super helpful. But you hope that with support, they gain independence in being able to do that. Maybe for some kids, that's being able to say, hey, I'm really stressed out. I had a kid actually come to my office today, and he was upset about a science test that he had. And he said, I asked for a break and I went for a short walk with my para. I'm like, excellent. And then what? He's like, then I found you and now we're talking. And I said, great. Did you blow up? No. Did you hurt anyone? No. Did you destroy property? No. Did you hurt yourself? Nope. I said, awesome. So now let's think about the tools that you used And how do we plan ahead next time, just to prepare better, maybe for that test? How can we do that? So he kind of learned to regulate himself. Now, is it successful 100% of the time? Nope. But we want to catch them when they can. And I always think paras, God bless you. You are like the co-regulators of the school. When we know that a student is struggling with that regulation, it's really helpful to have someone that they have already have a relationship with, can use the same language, and then can help with that co-regulation. It's super powerful in teaching those things and really builds relationship. So once you co-regulate, you can talk about things. Now, like you see in phase 3, that crisis, you might have to do a room clear. You're not always going to catch the trigger and you see the escalation happening. But if that window of tolerance is short and it goes quick, it might mean that the crisis mode comes quickly and you weren't able to stop it. That's okay. That's still going to happen. None of this is 100% foolproof. There's times in that crisis mode where you might have to remove the other students and make sure that they're staying safe. So hopefully you're developing that plan before the crisis, and access personnel or help in those situations where you notice that a kid's has that tendency to be in that crisis mode a lot. The recovery, phase 4, you see a lot of tiredness, the stimulus is coming down, and you don't want to assign independent tasks at this point or even really talk about it. Just kind of give them that space to recover. That post-crisis, that's where the learning happens. That's where you want to continue to build and talk about what happened. And I'll have Laura go into that a little bit further as we go. So that's those calming strategies with deep breaths and working through that can really help build that relationship with that student. So co-regulation, I talk about it a lot. So we want to teach kids what regulations actually means and what it can look like. And this is a short, super cute video. It's the cute version of co-regulation. Now we all know there's some ugly co-regulation and it doesn't always go beautifully, but I share this little clip with my kids in guidance so that they can see, okay, what happened? And we start picking apart what happens in this video that we can learn from it. So I'm going to share it with you. It's less than a minute and it's super cute. You see it?
Take another deep breath. Take a deep breath. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay, look at mommy. Look at mama.
Okay. My head.
I know you smashed your fingers in the door, didn't you?
Yeah.
Okay, take a deep breath. Okay, are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay, look at mommy. Say, I'm okay.
I'm okay.
Say, I'm strong.
I'm strong.
Say, I'm beautiful.
I'm faithful.
Say, I'm loved.
I love.
Say, I'm worthy.
I'm very.
You're beautiful.
Thank you, Mom.
You're welcome, baby. I love you.
I love you, Mom.
Kids absolutely adore this video because she's cute and they can relate, right? But the thing that we talk about, that conversation that we share about that is, what did you notice that mom did with her? Well, she helped the little girl take deep breaths to calm. Yes. What did the little girl want to focus on? The pain and what happened. Now, did you hear mom say, stop, be quiet. We're not going to think about that. Nope. She said, I know. She validated her by saying, I know you smashed your fingers in the door. And then she asked her to focus. Look at me. Let's take a deep breath, take another one. And then she used positive words to change that thought process, right? And it was done beautifully. You can see it. If you ever get a chance, Google this. That's what I Googled. And you watch her face, her affect changes with that positive because she's already kind of forgotten about it. And thank you, mom, because she is able to notice that change in her body and her brain. So I love that video. It's just adorable. Anyway, that's the cute version of co-regulation. And what happens there is holding space for big emotions. Now, emotions big emotions are not always angry, right? It can be fear. So fearful. I mean, that's a lot of times the root of trauma is that fear of that perceived threat, but it can also be pain. It can also be so much sadness. And so, whether it's trauma or depression or anxiety, any type of thing, even your own kid being disappointed, these holding space for big emotions, this is where relationship builds. This is where de-escalation can help. So in order to teach our kids to process emotions, we have to allow the emotion and hold space for it. So instead of saying, oh, you're fine, don't worry about it, acknowledge it. It helps to validate that, instead of that old way that I probably grew up with. No offense to my mom, but oh, good thing you're tough, you're fine, hop up, let's go, you're okay. That's kind of how I was taught. But it's okay for kids to be in a little bit of discomfort for a little bit. Just acknowledge it. And then when you're ready to kind of regulate and move on. So we know that when we're holding space with emotions, as you noticed, even in that video with the mom and the little girl, first, like I said earlier, you must regulate yourself prior to helping someone else regulate. So deep breaths. You know what? Sometimes I think the best thing you can do for a child is say, you know what? I need a minute. I am afraid that I'm not in a good place to help you. So if you can just give me a minute, I would really appreciate it. That might flip the switch anyway, just them thinking, whoa, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that struggles with this. That can be really kind of a neat relationship thing too. And you want to catch them and yourself before being triggered into a point of saying things you don't mean and whatnot. So I love this slide, and I won't read it because I know that you're able to do that, but keeping them safe is huge. Active listening, maintain your own regulation, accept their feelings, and just give them time. I do use zones of regulations, and like I had shared earlier, I like to use that universally so that language can be built upon. So my K-4 students know what de-escalation means, and I teach it like this. It's changing from one zone to another. So if you are in the yellow zone, let's see how we can change ourselves down to the green zone so we're calm and we're focused and we are ready to learn. So that's de-escalation. I can also say sometimes we need to escalate, right? If we're in the blue zone and we're tired and we don't want to get up and we don't want to go to school, how do we regulate so that we get into the green zone so we're ready to go for the day? And kids love to talk about what they do to regulate. Oh, as soon as I brush my teeth, I feel like I come alive again and I'm not yawning anymore and I stretch and I take my deep breaths. So regulation it's not always negative, right? Sometimes just means I need to get ready to go. Even I know teachers like to do some of those transition times. They might shut the lights off, or there's some fun little clapping things or some little saying things. I use that as an example of my K-4 guidance of regulating. We're needing to get down to a focus matter. I need to do something quick. And they usually are like, that actually works. I'm like, well, there you go. That's kind of a regulation tool too. So they appreciate that, and they can understand that helps everybody get focused into that green zone where we're ready to learn. And you want to have those calm conversations when you're in the green zone. That's where learning can happen, and you can promote self-regulation just by talking about that process, right? So we're talking about, I notice you're getting upset, some of those things that I've talked about. Like I said, I appreciate the zones of regulation with our students. I don't know if you're using it, and you don't necessarily have to. It's just, we started it last year with my first year there, and it's just been kind of an overall theme. The first year was last year, and now I sprinkle it in throughout our guidance. And it's a great understanding of body cues, emotion identification, and regulation skills that can help all students identify how they feel and what they need to do to regulate what actually works. So an example of this is the skills can be processed, increase self-awareness in that. And I'll share an example here in a little bit. But again, like if you and your school have the PBIS and the expectation for desired behavior is known in each area, this is another way to help kind of all filter in together. So just kind of having that in your back pocket. And it's not zones, there's all sorts of different ones. I just use this as an example because this is what I know. Okay. So I do have a a couple stories that I wanted to share. And I just want you to know that this is, again, I don't think any of these are 100% foolproof. I was just telling Laura, kind of my guidance today was kind of one of those that's not one I want to share because it wasn't as positive as one of these ones that I am going to share with. So give yourself some grace. There's going to be some times when it works beautifully and other times when it doesn't. It's okay. We all try our best, and that's what we can hope for. So the first story I kind of wanted to share is I had a learner in my kindergarten guidance class. And so a little bit about this kiddo. Mom stated that something might have happened at daycare when he was younger, but trauma is unknown. He has an outpatient counselor that he sees, and so I respect that. But the teacher has states that he runs, he hides, emotionally blows up when things get difficult, avoids things at school. He's tired a lot. He does have a one-on-one para. Again, I like to call them co-regulators. That day, his co-regulator or his para was not in my classroom. She was outside, I believe. Maybe she wasn't there. I can't remember now. But we were doing something. They had markers, and I asked if anybody wanted to share. So of course I choose the one that has their hand up. He didn't have his hand up, and I said, okay, you may share. And he immediately started throwing the markers, stood up, tipped his chair. I wanted to go first. As I was hoping that somebody in my mind, I was hoping, oh, somebody take him out. And with this particular student, I have had to clear the room before in guidance. And I thought, I'm going to try something different. So I gave myself permission to stop what I was doing because the entire class was watching, right? And so I went over and I said, wow, I didn't see your hand up. I'm sorry. I didn't know that you wanted to share. But it looks like you're really upset, and I'm sorry that you're like having this difficult time right now. Can we talk about it with your class? No. And I said, I think it's important that we get some help because I think we all want you to feel better. And I said, kids, and mind you, we've all had zones of regulations at this point. And I said, let's take some deep breaths. Everybody can help take us deep breaths. So they all did it. He was not doing it. And I said, okay, what can we do that might help him? And somebody raised their hand. And at this point, I am at his level on my knee, taking a knee, and my hand's out, and he's kind of resting in my arm, not hugging or sitting, just standing there. And he's listening. And I'm like, all right, who has an idea? And somebody, maybe he needs to take some deep breaths himself. No, I'm not taking deep breaths. I'm like, okay, that's not going to work for him. Anybody else? Same kiddo, very helpful. Maybe he just needs a huggy. I love that, right? Kindergarten love. I said, oh, that's a good idea. That always makes me feel better. Hey, kiddo, do you need a hug? And he said, yes. And that little boy melted in my arms, and I could feel his body just kind of like, oh. And we sat there quietly. The kids didn't do a thing. They just kind of watched. And I'm like, are you feeling better? And I'm quiet at this point, right? And it's just kind of him and I there, and they're all watching. And I said, okay, are you feeling better? Yeah. Are you ready to share with the class? Yes. I said, okay, but what do you need to do first? What do you think? He's like, I need to pick up my markers in that chair. I said, okay, let's do that. So he did. He picked up his markers, put them on his table, put his chairs up. And I said, okay, before we share, what do you think you need to do? I want to share first. I'm like, you guys ready to listen to what he wanted to share? Yeah. So he came in the middle and he shared. It makes him happy when he gets to spend time with his family at his grandma's house. Like, oh, and it was like, that makes me feel happy too. And I said, okay, one more thing. How do we repair the harm, kiddo? And he's like, I need to say sorry. Yeah. And I said, is everybody ready to hear his apology? Yeah. I said, why don't you go around the room and tell him? So he went around the room. I'm sorry I got upset and threw my markers. And he went around, gave everybody 5. It's okay. It's okay, buddy. I get mad too. And we were back at it. And he listened contently to everybody else share. It was a beautiful thing, right? That was perfect. We co-regulated. We got through it. Now, that didn't happen today, and it was kind of the same kiddo, but I'm not going to go there just due to time. But just know that was one of those moments like everything just clicked. It really worked great. So the second story, again, this was a different kindergarten class. We have 2. There's a couple in the class that have difficulties with attention. I am not aware of any traumatic experiences with a couple of these kids, but I could be wrong. Like I said, we don't always know, right? So what was happening, there was one kiddo laying under the table in the chairs. And normally I'm like, come join us in Mrs. Secchi's pit. I have the tables and we have a little circle. And we said, well, let's talk about regulation. We did our deep breaths and there's a couple that didn't do it. And I said, I'm going to share a story with you. And they're all sitting there, but there was two kids kind of jacking around. I like to say they were kind of messing with the table and they weren't listening and they were kind of just laying around. Everybody else had the focus. I was sharing my story and I said, I want you to pick out 3 things that Mrs. Secchi really likes. And so the rest of the group did. And I'm like, yes, you guys were really focused and listen. You must have been in the green zone during my story. Yep, I was, Mrs. Secchi, and I know that you like this, this, and this. Awesome. Is there anyone, guys, in the classroom that you think is maybe not regulated right now, that's not focused and ready to learn? Maybe they're in the yellow zone. And they all point to the kid that's like under the table, right? I'm like, hey, so-and-so, I don't want to use names. Do you know what were the 3 things I liked in my story? He's like, no. And I said, okay, come here quick. Let's regulate. We're going to regulate just you and me. Everybody, I want you to see if we can help him. So we take some deep breaths and I say, okay, now I want to co-regulate. Let's mirror. So you watch me. Let's get both sides of the brain working together, right? And so we're mirroring and he's taking deep breaths. I'm like, okay, I'm going to give you an opportunity. Mrs. Secchi is going to tell a story. I want to see if you can focus and you can find the 3 things that Mrs. Secchi likes. I changed the whole story, right, for this kiddo. And he went bang, bang, bang and knew it. And I said, oh, do you feel regulated now? And he was like, yes. I was like, okay. What he liked about it is he didn't yell. I didn't yell at him. And he said, thank you, Mrs. Secchi. And the arms went around the neck. And I think it was because he knew that he was regulated and I didn't yell at him, but we were being mindful and intentional about how we chose to use that as a kind of a group learning experience. And then at times you need to circle up and resolve that conflict. But in that point, it was already done just in that example. So that was really pretty cool. And it really cultivated empathy towards the other kids. Now I have so many helpers like, hey, are you feeling upset? They've got the language down. So it's super cool. And they're able to recognize their own emotions and what zone they're in. And sometimes they're like, I am in the yellow zone, Mrs. Secchi. I need to take a deep breath. We need to do that. And we'll just do it as a class because we can take a minute and do that. And it's really beneficial. So just a couple examples that I want to share with you on co-regulating and how you can make it part of the whole class, which Laura will go into as well. What happens when a child feels connected? Well, that self-preservation center in the brain relaxes and helps the body to calm. The social and emotional hub of the mind generates these feelings of confidence, safety, and assurance that life is okay. So we're hoping to build this connection with students. And when we're doing that, we're building an environment with a culture based on respect, responsibility, and one that we did with that empathy, right? And so that's the culture we're talking about. So I'm going to switch it over to Laura. She has some really great experiences using this book, Hacking School Discipline. And she is a fellow intern from the University of South Dakota and have loved having her be a part of our team. And she's going to share with you today a little bit about hacking school discipline.
Thank you, Brandy. Hi, everyone. As Brandy mentioned, I'll be covering the conflict resolution and circling up. So this book, Hacking School Discipline, is one that our school has used. So for the teachers that are familiar with this book and the language, I'm sorry if it sounds repetitive, but thank you, Brandy. Hello, everyone. As Brandy mentioned, I'll be covering the conflict resolution and circling up as Maynard and Weisenstein lay out. When we address this, when we address conflict resolution through a trauma-informed lens, we keep the child's perspective in mind and think about how our actions are perceived by them. We don't want the process of the resolution to create trauma or to re-traumatize, especially since we don't always have that background, as Brandy has mentioned, what the child has been exposed to in regards to trauma. So in creating a culture to resolve conflict, we want empathy and responsibility at the heart of it, as Brandy had talked. And we at this school have utilized the book Hacking School Discipline. So my apologies if a lot of this language is familiar to you and it sounds kind of repetitive, but for the purpose of this presentation, we are going to be using some of the information from this book. Okay, next slide. Sometimes this is how my circle looks, a little conflicting, but how do we take that conflict and turn it into a resolution? The main thing is, as many of you as educators know, is communication. And one thing that this book talks about, there's these 5 points: to initiate, emphasize, analyze, and execute. So it's important then to emphasize and give words to the conflict. Use questions such as, what happened? Who has been affected by what you have done? And how do you think they felt when blank happened? And in what ways do you think blank affected them? This, you're helping them give words to the conflict. So then we execute and reflect. This is the mediation process. And many of you are familiar with how mediations work. So I won't go into detail with that. Next slide. So conflict resolution starts with respect. Recall the 5 things that Brandy talked about. And one of the first ones is, don't take it personally. Step back from the emotions and just respect the process and how it will all play out. Sometimes it just kind of, you know how it ebbs and flows and just naturally goes. So building a good relationship will start with respect for all those that are involved in the conflict. So when this has been established, then you have the solid ground to build the relationship on. So the classroom becomes a safe place when respect is present. Next slide. Relationships take work. That's why we have relationship responsibility, because we all have a responsibility to invest in our relationships. In this book that Brandy introduced, Hacking School Discipline, the author lays out these 7 steps that are on the slide. So, you identify the conflict and the guilty party in a loving and respectful manner. You invite the stakeholders to participate and include everyone who had an important role in the conflict. Then you're going to communicate the goals and values. What's the mediation's purpose? Have that in mind and write it on a small whiteboard or something and set it out so everyone can see what the expectations are. And keep them just short and simple. Then you're going to create a safe and supportive environment, and not just verbally. You can use lights or whatever, like some teachers will just turn the lights off just to get the kids quiet. And it gives them that quick second to focus. So this helps to create the environment, to put the focus back on the task at hand. Then you want to recap and share perspectives. So let each one tell their story, what their perspective is of what happened and how they feel about it. And tell them, we're keeping this short, just the facts kind of storytelling, and one at a time, raising hands. Then you're going to repair and reinforce positivity. So you'll establish a plan of action moving forward, reinforcing positive statements and action plans. So clarification is very important here, to go back through, go back through the process and talk about it. Then you build a therapeutic rapport. So the more students go through restorative mediations, the more positivity will start to reign in the classroom then. Circling up. So we're going to talk a bit about circling up. Some of you may, like I said before, already know this language. So again, my apologies for the redundancy. So what does circling up look like? So the classroom climate about finding balance. In order to obtain that balance, we take into account everybody's relationship in that class or in that conflict. So when an issue happens in the classroom, let's deal with it in the classroom. Students must be accountable for their behaviors and how it affects them. So when a student is removed, this is Maynard and Weinstein now, they're saying that when the student is removed, they are no longer accountable for the impact the behavior had on the relationships with the class. So depending upon what that removal looks like, this can actually create trauma or re-traumatize a student. As in Brandy's story earlier with the boy having the trigger with the vehicle, we never know what a child's trigger may be. So if we go to grab an arm or something to lead them out of the classroom, that hand grabbing may be a trigger. So we need to be mindful of any possibility of a trigger. We don't know them all, no, but we do need to be mindful with our actions and how the student may perceive them. Or it could go the other way. And the student may learn, hey, this negative behavior gets them out of the classroom and out of the responsibility of being held accountable to their relationship. So circling up, we're going to lay down the circle rules and let everyone have a voice, sticking to the facts only and keeping it short. This isn't always easy because we know we have students that can go on for a very long time. So after we have that, the sharing, then we're going to be talking about responsibility and how can repair the harm occur. So give cues if needed, don't let it drag out. Like I said, when this is done, when the student has shared, the conflict, then we're going to reflect on the process. And then in the circle with the students, you will know the conflict. You'll reflect on the conflict. Okay, what was the conflict? And then you're going to reflect on what did the student who caused the conflict decide the consequence should be. Then you'll talk about, well, what did we decide? What did the student decide he or she needs to do to repair that harm? And then you can reintegrate back into the classroom when it feels natural, when you feel like you've hit a natural point there. So encourage teachers and staff to participate in what it would be like with each other. Then we have our pushbacks. So overcoming pushbacks. There's always, like Brandy said, no one situation works perfectly. So when we have pushbacks, there's always another way you can reframe them. So to say it's not my job is, it's everybody's job. So no matter what your role is in school, student success is our job. It's all of our jobs. And it is really what makes the teachers and the paras and all the staff really shine. So the more time you just dedicate to creating successful students you feel heard, it's easier for your job will be easier. So educators understand that investment in classroom client and school culture doesn't always pay off overnight. You are aware of that. So the time that you invest in creating and facilitating a circle now can lower the number of redirections that you may have to give in the future. So this collective investment into building a culture of empathy, frame it as an opportunity to promote self-responsibility and effective action. So in the book, anybody if you get the book, you will see that in there, they have it laid out so simple. And so they have what's this blueprint for full implementation. And it has some very, very helpful hints in there on how to initiate these circles, how to deal with the conflict resolution. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Brandy.
All right. Thank you, Laura. That was great. And that book is wonderful. One way that we did use it with our school was through a book study, and we would get together and read each a chapter a week and get together. We had some questions and just some conversation about what worked and what didn't. And that book, like Laura said, is super easy because it has the implementation kind of down step by step. So she did a great job of kind of bringing up the pieces, but it is an easy read, and it can be really helpful for the environment of your school. So piecing it all together, the conflict resolution through a trauma-informed lens kind of looks like this. Practice and shared responsibility and regulation. Narrate with common social emotional language if possible. Respond with care and understanding. Expect mutual accountability for all parties involved, staff and students, and expect respect and dignity for all. Build a culture of empathy and watch the beauty of empathy, respect, and responsibility unfold into a culture that cares for others. And that is our goal, is to help students become their own advocates and self-regulators, so they will need us less to co-regulate with them. So that is all we have for you today. Thank you for your time. Is there questions? I haven't looked at the chat.
We don't have anything in the chat, but if anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. And I also have the poll that I'm going to launch here, but thank you, Brandy and Laura, both so much. That was wonderful information.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, this will be posted on our web page, hopefully within the week, along with the PowerPoint, so you all have access to that as well.
Thank you, Amber. And I will get up some resources that we talked about today too.
Perfect.